Dear audience, today we have yet another broadcast of a podcast for the Riga Security Forum 2022. And today it's on Europe's energy security. How much we can rely on it? Is it still there? Is it yet to be there? And what aspects can shape the energy security of the European Union and Europe in a bit broader sense? I have the pleasure of having the opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Frank Umbach, who is head of research of gases. He's also the official consultant of NATO on energy security issues since 2012. Welcome, Dr. Umbach. Welcome, Frank.
Welcome to Riga. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Happy to have you here. Happy to have you on board to discuss this extremely important topic. Let me jump into the boat straight ahead. So I usually, when speaking about energy security issues, distinguish between three important dimensions of energy security: the infrastructure dimension or the physical dimension, the regulatory or the market dimension, and last but not least, definitely also the socio-economic dimension, how much we can afford to pay for energy or for our energy security. Do you, in broad terms, agree with this setup?
Yes, I agree with the setup. So I always try to explain also the challenges and risks in the context of the so-called energy trilemma, which means that energy security is defined by climate environmental issues, by economic issues, as well as by supply security issues, and complicated also by two other factors. One is the expansion of renewables, which has also an industrial aspect in terms of the motivation why we expand renewables. It's not just an environmental aspect, and the other one is a very complicated one, that's public opinion, which are very affecting, for example, all kind of investment decisions today. When we speak about energy infrastructure, whether that is, let's say, a gas power plant, whether that is electricity lines, etc. In highly density countries such as Germany, all kind of these investment decisions are sometimes blocked by environment local organizations, where they normally agreed, for example, to expand renewables. They also recognize we need to build new electricity grid lines from the north to the very south in Germany, from the new offshore fields in the Baltic or the North Sea, with electricity cables going to the land, and from there feeding the electricity to the existing electricity lines. But we also need to build very often new lines, smart grid systems for the expansion of renewables, and those are very often blocked in countries with a high density of population, which following the so-called NIMBY impacts. So they basically increase the expansion of renewables, but not in my neighborhood, so to speak. And that complicates the situation. And not just in Germany, we see there's a gap between the expansion of renewables. Every year, more and more electricity is being provided, for example, but not all of this generated electricity can be brought to the consumers, whether that's private households or the industry, because the electricity lines are still not in place. Even in China, we sometimes see that public opinion are blocking those investments. And so public acceptance, whether we like it or not, have become, particularly in democracies, very determining factor, which is also complicating the energy supply and security sometimes. And that needs to be taken into account.
Yes, definitely. So it appears that Europe in general has plenty of generating capacity, and the transmission and distribution networks are rather well developed, but there are still challenges related to the ability of these networks to absorb the increasingly dynamic development of an installation of renewable energy technologies, be it offshore wind or even now offshore solar electro power plants, and also definitely different sorts of technologies on land. So this NIMBY, or not in my backyard aspect related to the social acceptance is playing a role. Definitely, I know that in the Baltic Sea region it is a notorious barrier, in fact, for deployment of onshore wind power installations. Not so much probably for offshore wind, but definitely I think we have to be aware of this public opinion, which in a way the society understands that we have to shift away from fossils, from fossil fuels and fossil energy generating technologies, but on the other hand, nobody or too few people are ready to embrace these changes. And do you see this as an increasingly growing barrier, or have we been able to somehow convey the message that we have to switch away from fossils and somehow deploy more these renewable energy technologies? Do you think we are still standing at this barrier, or are we somewhere on top of it or on the other side of it, especially given the recent geopolitical developments and Russia's aggression in Ukraine?
No, I think this is part of the so-called, what we normally call the energy transition and the risk and challenges of the energy transition. It depends very much also how fast you can or you want to transit to a non-fossil fuel area, what you can do. I was never been so optimistic to do it so fast as many people in Germany would like to see that. That's not because I'm against it, but I see how it's extremely difficult. I'll give you just one example. The new German government wants to fasten the investment decisions, so that means you need to have regulatory policies in place with the bureaucracy to fasten the decision making, to prove environmental investigation and all these kind of things before something can be built. And that takes too long. When you take an on-land wind power plant, it takes in Germany approximately 7 years from the planning before the construction begins, and that's far too long. We won't be able to achieve the agreed targets within the EU of the European Green Deal, by increasing, for example, the emission reduction from -40% to up to -55% by the year 2030 if we are too slow with these kind of investment approvals in our country. But on the other hand, we are a democracy. You need to give people a basic right also to protest. This is part of our understanding how a democracy and the rule of law and the checks and balances are guaranteed somehow. So with other words, there are also limits, how you can constrict, how you can reduce the interventions from people who feel be hurt by those investments in their neighborhood. This is a delicate balance between the overall interest of energy security or the energy security of a country and individual rights you have to preserve to some extent. And for all these reasons, as I said before, we have concentrated so much since 2002 in Germany on the expansion of renewables, on the generation of new electricity, but we have never really thought through that in a broader context to balance these investments also with investments of building new transmission and distribution grids. So we generate every year more electricity, but we can't transport that electricity to the consumer places because we don't have the transmission and distribution grids in line. Yeah, when you take the example that most of the German nuclear power plants, for example, are phased out in the southern part of Germany, in Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg. Yeah, but most of the new offshore wind power are, of course, in the north, in the Baltic Sea, in the Nordic Sea. And so you need to transport more than ever electricity from those offshore fields, not just to the neighboring federal states of Germany, but to the very south ones. And the electricity lines are not in place still. Yeah. So this highlights the problems which you also have in other countries. I know from Poland, for example, Poland has dramatically, impressively expand offshore wind power, but at the same time, it's extremely complicated to build any kind of wind power plant on land. Yeah, so here again, Poland has also quite similar problems with NIMBY. And that sometimes threatening also the national energy plans, and ultimately then also the overall agreed targets of the EU's energy policy in the midterm perspective by 2030.
Yes, definitely. I think you pointed out rightly that the infrastructure problems are associated also with the ability of geographically bigger countries to transmit the cheaper electricity that has been produced from renewables mainly, or from nuclear, to those parts of the country which are bigger consumers. So I think two other very pronounced examples of this problem are Norway and Sweden, in fact, in the on the Baltic Sea region and Nordic region, where the cheapest energy sources lie in the very north, as in the form of large hydropower electric plants. And then the big question is how quickly and what sorts of volumes can you transmit down south, if I may say so. But right, we understand that energy transition definitely is there. We feared at the beginning of this year with the Russian aggression against Ukraine, we feared that this new crisis might actually somehow derail our energy transition processes and derail the whole idea of the green energy transition. However, the other scenario was that it's actually going to play out as a boost, as a significant boost, or even as an event that is disruptive to the current system, and that provides a unique opportunity to actually make a big leap towards embracing more renewables and going away from fossil fuels. And let me just quickly for a moment return to the current state of affairs. Reliance on natural gas in many European countries is still extremely high. It has always been. It has been higher than it is now. Many changes have happened since the Russian invasion in Ukraine in February. Many policies have been revised, but still, do you see that Europe is still able to find new sources of supply, new routes of supply? And do you think that the Europeans are ready and willing to pay the price, competing with other world markets for the same scarce resource, which is natural gas, which is enjoying extremely high prices now?
Yes, I think there are also a lot of myths surrounding when you also address geopolitics, maybe an issue we can also discuss later, because in Germany we still have the myth that geopolitical risks are only related to fossil fuels and not renewables. I think that's totally wrong. But in respect to natural gas, I should remind ourselves that Europe has a lot of natural gas reserves, including my own country. And these are the unconventional gas reserves. And this refers to the fracking debates we had some years ago in Europe. Germany has unconventional gas resources which may last for the next 60 years. So we can, at least for 20-30 years, completely cover the natural gas demand, which will shrink anyway over time. We made this debate how fast we will use natural gas. When you're looking to the official EU policies, European energy deal, we had a policy agreed that approximately by 2030 we wanted to reduce energy or gas consumption already by 20%, and then after 2030 then phase out also natural gas. May disagree how fast it can be done. I'm not the one who is too optimistic. I have always argued it will take certainly a little bit longer, but this was the basic policy already in place before the Ukraine conflict or the war started. It's somehow contradicting and ironic somehow, because Germany, after 20 years of discussions we had, and I was one of the very lonely voices in Germany who criticized the high German gas import dependencies for 20 years. I have argued from the very beginning against the Nord Stream 1 pipeline back in 2005 and becoming too much dependent on Russia. Now we will build at least 2 or 3 fixed LNG terminals on land. We have chartered, the government has chartered 5, maybe even 6 FSRU ships, the floating storage and regasification units for the next several years. The first one will be in operation at the end of the year, the second one at the beginning of the year. Though that goes back to similar discussions we had 20 years ago, and I was a strong supporter of diversifying Germany's gas import dependencies by building those terminals already back in 2006. But only now the government has decided upon, because it sees, despite the expansion of renewables, we won't be able to guarantee energy supply security in the short and medium solely by renewables. And that's the reason why we import, or will import, also LNG. But as I said, again, we could use also unconventional gas reserves. And that would have 2 major benefits. The first one, it would strengthen energy supply security, because it's a domestic source. And the second one is interesting, which has not been highlighted in our discussions at all. Yeah, if we would rely more on domestic gas resources, being conventional or unconventional ones, means ultimately we are also contribute to climate protection. Why? Because the import of natural gas, be it from Africa, be it from Qatar, be it from the United States, will always cause much more CO2 and methane emission than if we would rely at home. Why that is the case? Because the environment regulations in all countries outside of Europe are on a lower standards than we do than those existing here in Germany. And then you have to transport LNG from the United States, from Africa here to Europe, and you need ships. Ships need oil for transporting that, and that produces also CO2 and methane emissions. Yeah, and if you rely on domestic resources, you don't have these kind of CO2 and methane emissions. And that means you will always contribute to global environmental policies, yeah, by producing much less CO2 and methane emissions, alongside what we call life cycle analysis, which starts from the production fleets, from the investment, including the transport ways, to the ultimate use in power plants. Yeah, and that's completely overlooked in those discussions, and including in Germany, and people now beginning to wonder why we import fracking gas when we still have our own fracking gas. Yeah, so this is one of the contradiction which came out of the recent energy policy debates. And I think when you take the example of UK, which will restart fracking on land, as the government has just decided. So there is some kind of rethinking along these lines.
Definitely. I think the European countries are actually looking for all possible solutions to, both short and medium and long-term solutions to this, well, the price crisis, if I may say so, and also supply crisis as well as, I mean, to refurbish or to revamp all the system of importing those missing energy resources that cannot be produced domestically, that takes some time and effort, and it definitely is costly. So switching away from, well, or somehow cutting out 40+% of imported natural gas, which is roughly Russia's share in European energy supplies, is definitely not an easy feat. So we have to be ready to pay as well. Do you think the European consumers are ready to pay, or do you think that this energy security aspect might somehow stumble upon the willingness of European consumers to somehow be more resilient towards these prices in short and medium term, in favor of making investment in these longer term solutions, which would be more sustainable and more favorable also for the wallets, if I may say so?
No, I think the price explosions we see, including in my country, are hurting people, are hurting the small and medium-sized companies in a way which they cannot afford to pay these prices. That's the reason why national decisions are trying to create a price cap, why we do have European debates, but it's complicated when it comes to the imports because we have to rely here on a world market. And we have just seen in the recent decision of OPEC Plus that unfortunately the OPEC countries, including Saudi Arabia, are not following the Western sanction policies. Yeah, they have agreed an oil production cut by 2 million in principle, which is not in the overall strategic interest of the West. It's certainly not in the overall strategic interest of the world economy, because it complicates also the revival of the world economy, which is still hurt by the Corona and COVID discussions, COSA developments. And so nonetheless, we have to deal with the geopolitical realities as they are. And I should just remind how big the challenges are. We last year, the EU 27 countries imported 150 billion cubic meters of Russian pipeline gas and additional 50 billion cubic meters of Russian LNG. So we had a situation on the world market which was until the beginning of 2020, so prior to the COVID, when the COVID pandemic started, a situation on the world market which was quite comfortable in a word. We had a certain kind of oversupply of oil, in particular gas, which explained why the gas prices had decreased so much until the beginning of 2020. And then in the first months of 2020, even more when the global pandemic started. And that changed then at the end of 2020 when an economic revival of China began, and nobody was really prepared at that time. Yeah, so what I wanted to say is the price explosion began already before the Ukraine conflict. This is important to recognize. Yeah. It's not just the Ukraine conflict which led to the price explosion. Last summer, we had a situation on the gas markets where the European gas storage sites had not been filled up by additional Russian gas. We only later discovered or interpreted that kind of Russian policy, which was probably part of the Ukraine war in preparation as a warning signal to the West and to Germany in particular, probably. And so now we do have a global market where the balance between supply and demand is somehow balanced off. Yeah, and now you have to cover additional 155 billion cubic meters of gas, which we need to replace, and only few cubic billion meters of gas can be supplied by Norway, by Azerbaijan in the next years by pipeline. So the 130 billion somehow needs to be replaced by importing LNG from the global market, which is already tight. Yeah, so we are certainly in the financial position, most of the European countries and the EU, to compete on the global market and to buy that LNG by competing off other countries. Yeah, which leads to a situation that other countries don't have the possibility any longer to import LNG on turning, for example, to coal. But of course, we have not so much in this respect a supply problem, but even a bigger problem in terms of the explosive prices and who can pay these kind of explosive prices for how long. As we expect that the supply situation for natural gas will not change over the next year. It will last into the year 2024, 2025. So the challenges in this respect, in terms of the explosive prices, will not go away, although I have also to admit that the peak of natural gas prices has now been reached on August 26th, and afterwards the prices went down. They went up a little bit with the speculations taking place in context of the recent sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. But in general, there's a trend of going down. Yeah. But still, many companies in Germany, the gas importer Uniper, for example, had to be bailed out by the government. Otherwise, they would be gone bankrupt, and it's needed to do it, as otherwise supply security, gas supply security, very important for the industry in Germany, the chemical industry, cannot be guaranteed, and that's a big challenge as we are still in.
So it appears that the Europeans actually have no big choice. They have to be ready to pay a little bit more, or quite a bit more, rather, frankly, for some short and medium term to be able to switch over to more sustainable ways of energy supplies and energy production in the future, in the long term. But let us see how many Europeans are happy with that. Probably they are more understanding of the situation, given this recent developments that you referred to, also to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which definitely contributed to the situation of high prices. But the high prices, as you correctly noted, began slightly earlier than that. Let us remind that in many European markets for electricity was almost the cheapest in the period of 5 years. The same for natural gas. 5 years prior to 2021, where, I mean, historically lowest gas prices globally, it was definitely a buyer's market. The same for electricity. And now I think the shock that we experienced was because exactly of this big difference between the historically lowest and historically highest prices of these products, both of energy resources and energy that is produced from these resources. So that has contributed to this shock effect, most likely. So probably there is no good and quick answer for those Europeans who are asking whether we will have to pay even more, or how long we will have to be paying these high prices. So there is no very good answer in short term, but in long term we could probably say that once we proceed very rapidly with energy transition, and the markets quiet down or calm down in a way, then this perspective looks not as bleak, and it looks much better in the longer term.
I think the challenge has also to do what we see now is sometimes also contradicting development. You have referred, there's a fastening of expansion of renewables as part of the European Green Deal, and then this is also an argument being used for the Ukraine war, to fasten the expansion. But we also see more investment in new fossil fuel projects, particularly natural gas projects in the North Sea. You see UK, as I said, it's also investing or will allow fracking gas, but it also invests in new offshore gas fields. We see also Norway, even the Netherlands investing in new offshore gas fields. And that has raised also the question whether they will become stranded assets as maybe over the next, let's say, 10, 20 years, not so much gas will then be used. Of course, would help for the next 5 to 10 years, but not necessarily whether we need it also in 15 or 20 years. But we see these contradicting also investment decisions going meanwhile. And that again signals some kind of also reassurance for the gas markets, even in the short term. The German government, for example, has decided we have already phased out any coal imports from Russia. We will, at the end of the year, phase out any oil imports. And even in terms of natural gas, there's a decision by the German government to phase out all Russian gas imports by the end of 2024. So that's a very ambitious policy. The EU has a policy in place to phase out all fossil fuels, including natural gas, by Russia at latest by the year 2027. These are the targets, and for this kind of energy transition and to achieving the targets, the next years will be very, very tough, particularly also, I think, over the next year. And then in the medium and longer term, I'm certainly more optimistic. Yeah, but as I said, even in Germany, I think there is a willingness to pay more for energy. But there are also limits because people and small and medium-sized companies have been hurt already by the COVID pandemic. So they don't have the financial reserves as big companies have. We have an insolvency rate in Germany this summer, which was 30% higher than last year. And the huge or the perspective was that by the end of the year, if the government would not jump in, this is a discussion with the 200 billion government support for businesses and private households. So without doing this, many of the small and medium-sized companies, such as bakeries, for example, would simply gone bankrupt at the end of the year, would simply disappear from the market, which nobody would like to see that. So this is
plenty of challenges.
The dilemma any government has to deal with, and there are certainly limits what the people, private households, as well as small and medium-sized companies in particularly, can pay in terms of the energy prices.
So the important thing is that, first of all, energy can be physically produced, transmitted, distributed for affordable price, or at least the price which is still affordable, which is not nice, but which is still affordable. The socio-economic aspects, the barriers probably are related to the social acceptance of some of the energy technologies, like onshore wind, for example, or onshore solar power plants, acceptance of extending the lifetime of nuclear power plants in some countries as well, which is a big debate which we cannot unfortunately cover in this short conversation. But if you would have to sum up the answer to the main headline question here, European energy security, reliable or not? Is it here or do we have it actually?
No, what you can't do is something what we in Germany learn painfully now is you cannot phase out everything at the same time. Yeah. And this is what we did in the past, yeah, and then hoping that the expansion of renewables can replace all fossil fuels even in the short term. That's not working. So you undermine your energy security. It leads also to price exploitations or contribute to price explosions, etc. It also creates, by the way, a lot of new geopolitical dependencies, because all renewable energy technologies, wind power, solar, but also all the digitalization technologies are dependent on a stable supply of critical, so-called critical raw materials, rare earths, lithium, and others. And here you have a European dependency. Geopolitically speaking, 80% comes from China when you include the refined products. So that means we're replacing one high geopolitical dependence, namely the gas dependence from Russia, with another one which is even higher to some extent. So this is not an argument against reducing the gas dependency in Russia. It's just highlighting these other challenges. It's not something you can do, let's say, in 10 years. Yeah, policies and political decisions makers tend at the moment to focusing on dealing with the gas import questions, price explosions related to the Ukraine conflict and the gas import dependencies. That's fine, yeah. But at the same time, the other resulting new geopolitical dependencies from that policies are not addressed sufficiently. That's my concern. And this is not something you can do in 5 or 10 years. You have to do it at the same time. Yeah.
Yes.
And this is the bigger global geopolitical dimensions we have to face, and we cannot put our head into the earth. Yeah, and we have to deal with it now, and that means also that we need to address those issues in a much more strategic way, and not just focusing on the daily problems we have to solve. We need to have a more strategic outlook policies, also in terms of investments, but at the same time dealing with the present realities and problems and challenges.
Frank, it feels like, well, I have to interpret your extended answer as a very cautious, yes, we do have energy security, but there are many question marks in there that we need to solve. And we didn't even mention energy efficiency, which should be and must be and will be a big part of the energy security, package, if I may say so. So I may just add from my own point of view that we can be probably cautiously optimistic. There are definitely huge challenges. I think the main challenges will be related to the ability and willingness of Europeans to really compete on a competitive basis with other markets in the world globally. Europe is only one of the prime markets. It's not even the globally prime markets. We know that it's in Southeast Asia, and if there is cold winter in Southeast Asia and demand goes up, the Europeans will have to open their wallets again. So there are many things which even do not depend on the Europeans and then willingness to pay, so to say. So yes, indeed, probably we should be cautiously positive about these things. With these words, I would like to thank you, Frank, for this conversation. We have just started warming up, I know, but well, probably we'll have another chance to discuss this. But I had the chance to have Dr. Frank Umbach, the research director of CASAS and consultant to NATO and energy security issues since 2012. Really a great expert on energy security issues. Myself, Reinis Āboltiņš, energy expert, currently working for the Public Utilities Commission with wholesale energy markets. It was my pleasure having Frank here, and thank you for watching, and many thanks to those who have made this podcast possible. That is Latvian Institute of International Affairs, NATO, and Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung. Thank you for viewing us, and thank you, Frank, once again for having this conversation.
I have to thank for the invitation. It was a pleasure to talk with you about it and the manifold challenges we face, and also addressing maybe some issues which are not so much in the public debate up to now.